Hi friends, this is Pastor Jen Lessard from York Baptist Church, and this is a Wednesday study hour moment. We will be having a new Wednesday study hour at York Baptist Church on Wednesday evenings at 6 p.m. We had our first session last night, and it went swimmingly. We were able to have some people join us from Zoom. So I will include all of that information in the comments section here. Just wanted to let you know that we are meeting in person and via Zoom. Our first session last night was the beginning of a new study that we're calling Meaningful Worship, Connecting Today's Worship to Ancient Practices. There has been a lot of curiosity around where our worship elements come from, and we wanted to have a chance to dig into this a little bit more. So this first week, I am leading people into discussions about the beginning of worship and what that looks like and where it comes from, and tying to ancient practices. And there are a few resources that we drew from this week. And again, I will list these in the comment section as well. The first one that we spoke a lot about was the book of Acts. There's a great deal in the Bible, in the book of Acts, and we spoke a lot about that. So there are several references in this conversation, so I will try to list those in the comment section as well. Another was the Didache, or Teaching of the 12 Apostles, and this is available free online in English translations, and also available on Kindle for like 99 cents. I'll speak more about that in a little bit as to what that is. It's an ancient resource. There are two books that I will draw from quite a bit, written by Robert E. Weber. One book is called Ancient Future Worship, Proclaiming and Enacting God's Narrative, and that was published by Baker Books in 2008. Another is Worship Old and New, and that was published by Zondervan in 1994. And I list these not as recommendations for purchase, just to reference where I'm getting some of my information. I attended a fabulous Bible study at a church I was working at years ago, and they used Weber's Worship Old and New book. I have some problems with the theology that he uses, so if you do purchase the book, just know that some of his theology can be problematic at times. There's an evangelical slant to it. There's also some implications that the Old Testament is no longer relevant because the New Testament replaces that. That's not consistent with the more progressive liberal theology that our church normally participates in. And equally true is that people are free to decide for themselves. So I list these two references because Weber's research is very helpful. It is very good research tying all of our worship elements that we've done for years. We've always done it that way. Why do we do it? Weber uses some very good research tying our existing worship practices to ancient practices in the early church. So that's my spiel on Weber. Go ahead and buy the books. Just those are my 2 cents about his theology. So before we really dug into any conversation yesterday, I invited the people in attendance to think of some questions relating to worship. one of the discussion questions I put before people were, have you ever worshiped at a church on a day different than Sunday? Or have you ever wondered why our tradition meets on Sunday? There were some people that had visited a lot of different churches. There was somebody who went to an Episcopal service on Wednesdays. There was somebody who had attended synagogue. There was somebody who had attended Catholic services on Saturday evening. There were many different experiences. Our church meets on Sunday morning, but not all churches do, so that's something to think about. Another question for discussion was, what does Sabbath mean to you? We meet on Sundays, and we've been taught through Sunday school that Sunday is the Sabbath day. What does Sabbath mean? Is it a day of rest? There was a lot of conversation around this also. This is a day where we can be with family. It is a day to maybe not work, if you're lucky enough not to work on Sunday, because a lot of people still work on Sundays. You don't have a choice. There's a lot around Sabbath and worship and tying those two ideas together. A third question we put forward is, what are some things that are done at the beginning of worship in our church or in other churches that we've worshiped at? So at York Baptist, we have a prelude. We will have a welcome and announcements. And we'll have an opening sentence, which is a unison sort of prayer to open worship together. Then we'll have a centering moment, time to be quiet, listening to a short piece of music, getting us into the presence. And then we'll have a verbal call and response, call to worship. Our friends at Emmanuel have a very similar experience. They have a prelude. They have welcome and announcements before the prelude. There's a call to worship that's call and response. So there were very, very similar things. The opening sentence and centering moment differed a little bit in the beginning of worship. So there was a lot of lively conversation about, oh yeah, this is what we do at the beginning of worship. So, think about those things. Think about your worship experience and what you remember about the beginning, that first chunk of worship. We're going to dig in a little bit now and think about some of the practices we see in the book of Acts and in the Didache. So the Acts of the Apostles. Here's a lot of background. If you have any questions, please email me at ybchurchoffice@gmail.com or message me via YouTube or Facebook, and I'll do the best I can to dig up the research that backs any of this up. So Acts of the Apostles, very briefly. The Acts are a companion book to the Gospel according to Luke. Scholars pretty much hold to the tradition that the Gospel according to Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same person. They're both addressed to a person named Theophilus, which really just means lover of God in Greek. That may have been an individual. It may have been just a general term. It was written sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, around 80 or 90 CE. The Gospel of Luke and Acts are both addressed to Theophilus, and even though it's not necessarily written towards a direct person, it may have been a direction to go spread this news. The title of Acts of the Apostles can be a little bit deceiving because it really focuses primarily on Peter and Paul and a very small handful of apostles, rather than all 12 of the original apostles we think of. There's a whole list of cities in Acts of these apostles traveling from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. It begins with Jerusalem, and then as the apostles travel through, it does end with Peter preaching in Rome. They traveled city to city, just as Jesus instructed, starting in Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. A lot of travel, preaching and persecution, small house churches, larger communities, baptizing new believers, and a lot of organizational stuff. It's a full book, and I invite us to do further study on Luke and Acts as at some point as a pair. There are a lot of congruities in those two books together. That's not something we're going to do in this study. I just wanted to give you some background as to what the book of Acts is. If you're interested in a Bible study on Acts, let me know, and we can dig into that another time also. The Didache. All right, the Didache, or the teaching of the apostles. So there's a lot of theories saying that an early church patriarch originally wrote this. It really depends. Didache comes from the Greek word for doctrine or the teaching. The earliest church had no real New Testament as we know it. They just had a collection of letters and documents that hadn't been compiled yet. Those weren't really compiled into a canon or a fixed Bible until the 3rd or 4th century. This document's argued as being one of the earliest guides for the church. It's debated as to when it was put together. Some argue it was written, at least in part, as early as 50 CE. Others argue it was probably more like 90 or 100. Or, still others argue it was pieced together more like in the 2nd and 3rd century. The only complete version of this text was discovered in Constantinople in Turkey, which was in Rome, and is in a Greek translation. This document, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, so this is just a lot of background to help us get into this study. So the Didache discusses how Christians are supposed to treat one another, how they're supposed to treat strangers, how they're supposed to treat fellow Christian travelers, how to treat outsiders, how to celebrate the Eucharist or communion was a big deal in this. And it makes sense to have some kind of instruction written down. Early Christianity was a movement, and Paul's letters are a good reflection of trying to develop some kind of structure around this new movement, the way. They didn't set out on day one having an organizational structure for a new church. So the Didache is a good reflection of just trying to wrap something around this. Paul's letters are also, if you think about the letters to the Corinthians and Romans, all of the letters are a reflection of trying to develop ways of treating one another and how to remember. This word remember is going to come up a lot. I will ask you to stop what you're doing write down the word remember, because that is a big focus in this study. Phew, that was a lot of talking. At this point in the discussion last night, we took a break and said, okay, now let's get back into those conversations about the beginning of our worship. So what we did was we described how worship happens today, particularly at the beginning of our worship time together. And if you're doing this from home, write down the words who, what, where, when, how, and why. So who's worshiping together? What are some of the first things that happen in worship? Where do we gather? And when do we gather? What day of the week is it? What time of the week is it? How are we gathered? Think about seating and positioning. Are we in virtual or physical spaces or both? Where's the altar? Those things. And why? Why do we gather every week? So there was a wide variety of answers for this. Who's worshiping together? It was often, well, you know what? It's people we know and want to see every week, and we sit in the same pews all the time, and some of it's habit. We gather at the same time every Sunday morning, except now York Baptist and Emmanuel Baptist have shifted their worship times a little bit. It gets us a little bit off of our routineness. So with each of these things, we dug into some of the ancient practices that we get the basic beginnings from. So who's worshiping together? That who? Christians were first Jewish Christians. So the religions had not initially split. That was something that happened after the Jewish-Roman War and the destruction of the Second Temple. Jewish Christians and Jews were worshiping together in the synagogue. What are some of the first things that happened in worship? The call to worship that we have the call and response for, that is likely from our Protestant roots, probably 16th, 17th century. Weber points to moving away from the focus of Eucharist and worship as education during that time, with a call to worship and prayer of approach before Bible readings as a focus. Weber also points out that synagogue worship would begin as an affirmation of faith, likely the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. The Shema is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. Weber points to Acts 2, verse 42, indicating that early Christians devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to fellowship, to the breaking of the bread and to prayer. He also argues that a creed was likely recited at the beginning of worship so that the worshipers able to enter vicariously into the original event. Weber was emphasizing remembrance as a part of early worship and connecting that with our worship today. We had a little bit of lively discussion around creeds because we're American Baptists and we're a non-creedal people. And I offered a little criticism against Weber's assertion that there was a creed recited, because there's really no evidence that he provides for this. I think the earliest Christians probably would have been very similar to synagogue worship, where they would have recited the Shema, because the Shema was, after all, the greatest commandment that Jesus pointed out. We should love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Thinking maybe that could have been it, but I don't have any evidence for that either. Moving on to our next part here. The general service of the word was documented by Justin Martyr in his 2nd century, The First Apology. And Weber cites this as listing the order of worship, something like this. First, there was a service of the word, and then the service of the Lord's Supper. Service of the word would include readings from the memoirs of the apostles and prophets. There's that remembering again. Then a sermon, and then the prayers. And then they would go through the service of the Lord's Supper. Readings from the memoirs of the apostles and prophets. A very important first part of worship. Where do we gather? Early Christians were part of the Jerusalem church, led by Peter and James, or city churches established by Paul, and later diaspora churches. Jerusalem Christians worship by breaking bread in their homes, yet every day they continue to meet together in the temple courts. This was from Acts 2:46. Church in Corinth was given instruction through Paul's letters. We talked about that some. Excuse me. When do we gather? Day of the week and time of day. Christians likely assembled for worship on the Jewish Sabbath initially. And that was from Acts 17 and 18, according to Weber. Revelations brings up the Lord's Day in Revelations 1:10. And it's also mentioned in the Didache, which directs that the church on every Lord's Day, his special day, come together and break bread and give thanks. It is a remembrance of Jesus' resurrection. This theme of remembrance keeps coming up over and over again, not just in Weber's work, but in Acts and in the Didache. This is where I strongly agree with Weber, is that a lot of our worship is tied to remembrance. It is a way to continue our faith. How are we gathered? So the seating in the first churches was probably nothing like what we are experiencing now. We sit in pews. Those didn't even come around. There were benches like in the 13th century. Pews didn't come around until the 14th or 15th century. For the most part, people would be either standing or seated. We talked a little bit about women and men being separated. That was a tradition from the Jewish temple, and that would have continued for a long time. Why do we gather each week? Well, we gather every Sunday as a celebration of the Lord's Day. We are a resurrection people. So this was kind of a lot for a first session together. I've kind of data dumped on you, and I apologize for that. This is a little bit more difficult than the last study hour we did, where we could kind of very casually talk about baptism and communion and do some storytelling around it. This is going to be a little bit more study, more Bible verses. I don't teach this directly out of the text because a lot of it's discussional. I will invite you to join us via Zoom. It was a great deal of fun having York people and Emmanuel Baptist people conversing together about worship. We had quite a few people, so the discussion was lively. It was probably closer to an hour and a half than an hour. As we closed our discussion, we asked two questions of each other. What about the discussion surprised us or found us otherwise curious? Somebody brought up the fact that Luke and Acts were written by the same person. They were surprised to learn that. some were curious about the Didache and wanted to learn more about that. Some were thinking more about our call to worship and why we do that. Some of these things we've just done because we've always done them. And it's kind of fun to think about, gee, why is it that we do this stuff every week? I know I enjoy it. We will get into the topics more of where did the hymns originate? Why do we do all these different things in worship? There are some very important elements that we kind of just do without really thinking about. And as we move forward, think about things that you wonder about. Where does that doxology come from after we offer our donations and our gifts? Why do we pass the peace? Where does confession fall into a worship service? Why is communion placed after the reading of the word? Start thinking of questions. When you're in worship, go ahead and wonder, hey, why do we do that? Why do we stand and sit? Why do we do things this way? Why do we have a procession in some churches and not in others? Bring a pencil to church. Write things down. I wonder why we do that. Scribble in your bulletin and bring them to our next study hour. Again, you can leave comments on this video either on YouTube or Facebook. You can email me at ybchurchoffice@gmail.com. I will list all this information in the comments, and hopefully we'll do some fun exploring together. I hope all of you are well. I am looking forward to continuing these studies, and let's be curious together. Keep you all in prayer. Blessings to you all. Bye for now.